You know, the way I see it, there are two main strands to the future of hi-fi, or as I tend to call it, future-fi. Now, the first strand is active speakers that contain a streamer, a DAC, a phono stage, an HDMI ARC input, and a subwoofer output. And the second strand is where we farm out that streamer and that DAC and that phono stage and that HDMI ARC input and the subwoofer output to an outboard amplifier that then drives a pair of passive loudspeakers. And today we ask, albeit somewhat crudely, which is best?
This episode is brought to you by T+A, makers of the Solitaire P headphones. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Welcome back, everybody. Yes, this is a video that will take a look at a passive loudspeaker system and compare it to an active loudspeaker system. Now, we recently covered option 1 with the PSB Alpha IQ, whose internal DAC and amplifiers come after the crossover in the signal path. That's the very definition of an active loudspeaker. And then option 2, the passive system, only came together after I made the Marantz Stereo 70S video review. That's really what provided the light bulb moment for this video. And as we saw in that Marantz video, the Stereo 70S is an AV receiver or an integrated amplifier that offers 75 watts per channel of Class AB power into 8 ohms with HEOS streaming, a DAC, HDMI ARC and subwoofer outputs, and also an phono stage, all in its internals. And that's pretty much the same connectivity suite as the PSB Alpha IQ Actives, but the Marantz will sit before the passive loudspeakers crossover. So the amplifier will come before the crossover in the signal path, and that's the very definition, I think, of a passive loudspeaker system. So it's all about where the amplifiers sit relative to the crossover and has less to do with where the power socket goes than you might think. And with both passive and active loudspeaker systems on hand, I could find out how the more separated hi-fi system compares to the PSB Actives. This is therefore a side-by-side comparison of two complete hi-fi systems. But because the Marantz amplifier has already eaten up €1,000, any partnering passive speaker would really need to come in at around €400 or less if it's going to match the total cost of the Alpha IQ, which I think in Europe sell for around €1,400. However, when I stumbled upon the Pro-Ject Speaker Box 5S2, I cannot believe they give it such a mouthful of a name, but here we are. When I discovered that they are also available in a yellow finish, just like the PSB, I chose to kind of look past their €649 asking price to prioritize color matching over budget matching. So you're gonna have to give me a little bit of latitude here, especially as we're also not factoring in the cost of loudspeaker cables. Like the yellow PSB Streaming Active, the Pro-Ject Passive is a two-way design where we get a 1-inch silk dome tweeter, and that meets a 5-inch fiberglass mid-bass driver that's augmented by a rear-firing bass reflex port. So that's essentially one more mid-bass driver inch on the Pro-Ject than on the PSB. And the Pro-Ject speakers drivers are housed inside an MDF cabinet, but unusually for a speaker at this price point, the Speaker Box 5S2 are made in Europe. I think it's also worth pointing out that the Pro-Ject's yellow finish isn't a gloss, but but more of an understated matte. And I gotta say, I prefer its mustard tone to the more in-your-face tangerine yellow of the PSB. Now, it was only later that I noticed that the original Speaker Box 5 was still listed on Pro-Ject's website. Therefore, I think that told me that it had not been discontinued, which I thought was kind of odd. So I asked Pro-Ject, what's new in the S2? Now, my Pro-Ject contact told me via email that the S2 isn't really intended as a Mark II model, but more of a better performing model than the original. And compared to the original model, the Speaker Box 5 S2 has special internal bracing, it has slightly different dimensions, it uses special eco-friendly glue, it has heavier construction, and also a slightly different tuning to the original. So I connected the Pro-Ject Speaker Box 5 S2 loudspeakers to the Marantz to set the scene for our passive versus active standoff, where system functionality was pretty much identical out of the box. So I think it's pretty obvious from the outset that the Marantz Pro-Ject combination is more physically and visually intrusive than the PSB setup, but unlike the PSB Actives, it only requires one power cable because both of the PSB Active speakers need to see wall power. And on sound quality, the Pro-Ject powered by the Marantz has more upper mid-range bite than the PSB, which makes the passive speaker system, so the Pro-Ject and the Marantz, sound more urgent and more exuberant than the slightly more laid back, certainly in the mid-range and above, PSB Actives. And this might be why the Pro-Ject and Marantz better communicate the rhythmic complexity of a track by Forest Drive West, which is kind of like modern day ambient techno. And even though the spec sheet threatens to contradict this, I think the PSB aced the Pro-Ject on low-end punch to really contrast the Pro-Jects and the Marantz as sounding, if not dry, but drier than the PSB. However, on sound staging of Monolake Silence, I guess that's also the most amazingly recorded electronic music album you'll probably ever hear. I think it's probably the best in my collection. The Pro-Ject/Marantz system sounds bigger than the PSB pretty much in all directions. Now, I'm not talking shocked YouTuber face bigger, but know that it's kind of like bigger in the same way that say a Toyota Corolla is bigger than a Toyota Yaris. In my PSB video, I added a KEF KC62 subwoofer to the system, so it's only fair that I do the same with the Pro-Ject Marantz combo. And I did. But the Marantz amplifier offers only fairly basic bass management, certainly compared to the PSB. The sub is low passed, and we can adjust the low pass filter point within the amp's menu settings, but there's no high pass filtering of the main speakers through the Marantz. They run effectively full range. So essentially, we're bringing the sub in from below to meet the speakers as they are. And with the sub in play, the Pro-Ject Marantz system sounds richer and, as we might expect, a lot fuller than before. And that has the knock-on effect of making it slightly better than the PSB with movie dialogue. I don't know why that is, but that's just the way I heard it. And it also lends more fullness to Sarah Nixie's vocal as heard on the Black Box Recorder box set. Sarah Nixie is the female vocalist of that band, which also features Luke Haynes, who used to be in the Auteurs, and John Moore, who used to be, I think, in the Mary Chain. However, the PSB, to me, remain kings of player placement and sort of overall image focus. And the PSB size means they are more likely to be run on a desktop than the Pro-Ject with Marantz. I mean, that would be kind of ridiculous to put all of that on a desktop. And the PSB can go there, and yeah, the Pro-Ject and the Marantz, they really can't. But know that just like the PSB, the Stereo 70S has no USB input, so we still need a USB SPDIF converter like the topping D10S to connect it to a PC or a Mac. Now, to regular viewers, it'll probably come as no surprise that I still much prefer the PSB's Blue OS streaming platform to Marantz's HEOS, which really comes up short on Tidal Connect and Roon readiness. So those two features are in the PSB speakers, but they're not in the Marantz. So instead I streamed my own content and Tidal content to the Marantz's AirPlay input, but still using Roon, and then added a side dish of Spotify Connect, which the Marantz can also do. But even when considering its streaming shortcomings, in my 6 meter by 5 meter listening room, I still prefer the overall sound of the Pro-Ject and Marantz setup. It just sounds cleaner and more urgent and more incisive. And those separates offer stronger dynamics and a better look at tonal contrasts, albeit, and this is something you've got to keep in mind if you're allergic to this kind of presentation, albeit with a slightly overall nervier, sort of edgier gestalt. Also, the Marantz has a half-decent 6.4mm or 1/4" headphone socket on the front, which obviously the PSB Actives do not. Now, beginners might not know that the loudspeakers in a passive system tend to influence sound quality far more than the upstream electronics like an amplifier or a DAC or whatever. So in my passive system, the Pro-Ject Speaker Box 5S2 are a much stronger flavour than the Marantz that powers them. But maybe you're wondering, just maybe, as I did, what happens if we swap out the Marantz for a similarly priced and functionally similar amplifier? And that amplifier today is the Bluesound Power Node, because that's what I had in my possession at the time of making this video. So in swapping out the Marantz for the Bluesound, we surrender the Marantz's Phono input to pick up 80 watts per channel of Class D power, all wrapped in a much smaller, much tidier box. And the Bluesound still has an internal network streamer and a DAC and an HDMI ARC input and a subwoofer output, just like the Marantz. And listening side by side, so the Marantz powering the Pro-Ject versus the Bluesound powering the Pro-Ject, the result is different, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily better or worse. So with the power node at the helm, I would say that the Pro-Ject speakers give us slightly more bass weight and maybe a shade more detail, but the sound is comparatively leaner and not quite as mid-range lush as with the Marantz. And with the Bluesound, we also pick up the very real benefits of high-passed filtered mains loudspeakers when a subwoofer is introduced to the system. So now you might ask, do I prefer the sound of the Bluesound amp plus the Pro-Ject speakers to the PSB Actives? And I think in a pinch, only just yes. And I think it's because the Speaker Box 5S2 are real overachievers at their price point. This is a fantastic sounding passive loudspeaker for the money, which might come as a bit of a surprise, I think, to many regular viewers, because I've been quite bullish about the convergent nature of active speakers these last, 3-4 years, everything in one box, just plug them in and off you go. Because putting everything that we need inside the speaker is just so clean and tidy. And the technical arguments in favor of active speakers, I think, at least in my experience anyway, are unassailable. But then again, I'm not a loudspeaker engineer, so I can't really confirm or deny, but most loudspeaker engineers that I speak to say something like, all other things being equal, an active loudspeaker will give you a better audible result. But I guess, as this video proves, all other things are almost never equal. So this investigation has reminded me that if we put all the streaming and associated connectivity into an outboard amplifier and hook it up to a pair of overachieving passive speakers like the Pro-Ject Speaker Box 5S2, we really get to see and hear how the old school approach to hi-fi system building still has plenty of fuel left in the tank. Anyway, if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing down below. And if you like the music that you hear in this video, but you can't be bothered to Shazam it, you'll find playlists over on my Patreon. And yeah, thanks ever so much for watching.